Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on CMMC 2.0 and its implications for the defense industrial base. My name is Stan Awolomobo, and I'm a partner in the cybersecurity practice at Alex Partners. In my role, I lead our cyber operations and compliance service offerings. And I'm thrilled to be joined by an exceptional panel of experts today who are going to be sharing their respective perspectives on the new CMMC requirements. And first on the panel is Erica Antos. Erica is the Chief Information Security Officer at Mercury Systems, one of the defense contractors that are subject to this new set of requirements. And Erica, she brings an extensive experience in building not only cybersecurity programs, but also compliance programs. And she's currently leading Mercury Systems' efforts towards CMMC compliance. She also previously served as the CISO for Trinet X. Also joining us today is Amy Williams. Amy is the current Vice President of the CMMC practice at Coal-Fire Federal, one of the leading certified third-party assessor organizations, C3PAO organizations. And to put that in perspectives, that's one of about 60 C3PAOs serving almost 80,000 potential clients. And Amy previously has served and established different compliance practices. Most recently, she was a senior director at Blue Voyant. And finally, I'm excited to introduce Eric Forney. Eric is a partner at the global law firm DLA Piper, and he operates within DLA's white collar and securities practice. Prior to joining DLA Piper, Eric was a senior trial counsel at the Security and Exchange Commission based in Boston. Now you can see we have a very power-packed panel, and we're going to be covering the following important topics today. First off, we would start off with an overview of the CMMC 2.0 framework and its fundamental principles. We will get into talking about some essential information that defense contractors need to know and need to implement. We would also talk about some of the enforcement trends and notable actions related to the CMMC compliance. And last but not the least, we would provide perspectives on the future trajectory of this regulation, especially within the current administration. So we have a fantastic discussion ahead of us, and without much ado, let's dive right in. So let's start with a foundational understanding of CMMC 2.0. Amy, could you provide us an overview of the framework, its fundamental principles? Why are we even here today? What is the purpose of this? And just highlight some key things about this regulation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stan. So where we are right now in the evolution of CMMC is commonly referred to as CMMC 2.0. It's kind of interesting to look back at CMMC 1.0 as a historical reference. CMMC 1.0 started as 5 different levels. Level 1 was for federal contract information. Level 3 was for any company that had CUI. And then level 5 was for companies that were likely going to be a focus for advanced persistent threats. And levels 2 and 4 were designed to be stepping stones between 1 and 3 and 3 and 5, but they really became sort of confusing. Another thing that was confusing is that CMMC 1.0 was based on a number of different control frameworks, not just a simplified set of frameworks. And so working through all of that and doing some trial and error with a few beta test companies in seeing how this would work, everybody realized that it was too complex, that we didn't have the best direction for how we were going to go about assessing these companies. And so we took a beat, took a breath, simplified the program, simplified the approach to doing assessments, came up with a better strategy and approach, and that was CMMC 2.0. And CMMC 2.0 has 3 levels instead of 5. It makes a lot more sense. So level 1 is still FCI, level 2 is what level 3 was, and that's for companies companies that have CUI in their environment, and then level 3 is for companies that are likely going to be subject to advanced persistent threats. So level 3 was based on level 3 under CMMC 1.0 was based on a couple of different frameworks. Now it's just based on NIST 800-171. And level 3, which used to be level 5, is just based on NIST 800-172. So it makes it a lot simpler because, and this is a little bit in the weeds, but it's helpful for people to understand this. The security framework comes from NIST. The regulation is defined by DoD. Like this is what CMMC level 2 is going to look like. It's going to be based on NIST 800-171. Right now that's R2, but soon it will be on R3. So DoD defines what the levels are, and then there's the nonprofit organization, the Cyber AB, which reinforces how the community is educated and prepared, and defines whether or not C3PAOs are doing a good job and all of that. And because there's so many moving parts, it makes it too complicated to have multiple security frameworks to have CMMC based on. So it was super helpful to have CMMC level 2 simplified from multiple frameworks to just NIST 800-171. And we now realize how important that was, because R3 of 171 is out, and just that alone, having a different version of the same standard, has created some complexities. Another thing that is interesting about the evolution of CMMC is that a lot of people think of it as one regulation. It's actually two regulations. So CFR 32 defines what companies must do in order to comply with CMMC, and 48, which hasn't come out yet but is expected to come out this summer, defines how it shows up in contracts. And so those two pieces together will define holistically how members of the defense industrial base will go about complying with CMMC. That's the highest level version.
Thanks, Amy. Just a quick follow-up, and I really, like how you sort of broken things down. So within the CMMC 2.0, we're looking at three different levels. For a defense contractor, can you maybe speak to some of the assessment components or expectations? So for a level 1, am I supposed to do that as a self-assessment, or can I work with a third party? Can you provide a bit of color on that?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So for level 1, federal contract information, it's a handful of basically hygiene, cyber hygiene controls, and that is self-attestation. And you must, self-attest to having compliance with that on an annual basis. It's pretty straightforward and pretty easy to do. Some companies have come to us seeking advice on how to go about preparing for that, but there isn't any third-party assessment of that. Level 2, which is based on the 110 controls and 320 objectives of NIST 800-171 R2 right now, you must get a third-party assessment by a C3PAO like Coal-Fire Federal for that, and then we would issue a certificate if, in fact, you pass your CMMC certification assessment process. Level 3 is against 172, and that is assessed by DIBCAC, so by the DoD assessment team. And all they're doing is they're assessing the delta between your compliance with 171 and the additional controls required from 172 for level 3.
Thanks, Amy. So from a perspective of the defense contractor, so Erica, I'll move on to you with this one. Um, when this came out, what were some of the impacts to your organization or your approach? What was your reactions to CMMC 2.0 and some of the evolvement from like 5 levels to 3 levels? Did this really make any material impacts from your perspective?
Yes, actually, it did. Going from the 1.0 to the 2.0 was actually made it easier for companies like ours to work towards compliance because then we were working against a standard that we could implement within the organization. So that evolution of CMMC was definitely welcome within the organization. And in terms of the implementation of CMMC, it started within IT and security, but it's definitely a company-wide implementation. So we needed to reach out to all different parts of the organization in order to set up the controls and the requirements that were there, to get the documentation that we needed. There was definitely a lot of work involved, a lot of documentation that we had to gather in preparation for the certification. So having that standard, to be able to go against that standard, as opposed to having those 5 levels that Amy had talked about, definitely was helpful.
Got it. Thanks, Erica. And one of the things you mentioned was that is striking is it was beyond IT and security. You had other functions, other stakeholders involved. Maybe can you shed some light on some of the initial scoping? So as I understand, CUI, wherever it's, traversing across the organization, that comes within scope, and your interaction with some of the stakeholders that may be involved in managing CUI.
Yeah, so when we were first establishing the scope of CMMC and how that would apply, we needed to find out where CUI sat, where it was in the organization, where it flowed through the organization. That was much beyond security and the IT organization. So we needed to reach out to other parts of our organization, including engineering, including contracts and procurement, and to talk to them about what they interact with, the types of information that they get, and then where that information flowed. So our initial scope, when we first started this, was focused within a certain area from a technical perspective, but then we quickly realized that it was going to be much broader than that. And we ended up doing an enterprise scope for our CMMC certification because of where CUI sits within the organization.
Got it. Thank you so much. Amy, back to you. Can we maybe just move into the practical side of things here? Building on what Erica has shared, can you maybe share some of the essential information like a defense contractor would need to really understand and implement? Because from your perspective as a C3PO, actually conducting these assessments and certifications, what do you generally see companies go wrong at? Can they do better on? So can you maybe share some of that as it relates to scope, system security plans, and what you see from your gap analysis typically?
Absolutely. So, following on with what Erica was talking about with scoping, this is the critical first step. It's often the step that we don't see companies spend enough time on. People who've heard me speak are probably tired of hearing me say this, but I like visual analogies, and understanding how your CUI is mapped is the most important thing. You don't start with access control number 1 and start looking at evidence for access control number 1, because what's it against? Companies that only have a portion of their work with the DoD don't need to have their whole entire enterprise system in scope. So understanding where CUI and FCI flow throughout their organization, understanding how external service providers support their compliance, all of those pieces are really important. And so when we're doing a gap analysis, the first thing that we do is we go through this painstaking process where we start with contracts and say, okay, how many contracts do you have that have FCI and CUI in them? How does that information flow throughout their organization? And that's going to look different from company to company. So where does it go from contracts next? Does it go to a project manager? Does it go to an engineering department? And then where does it go from there and from there and from there until it exits the organization? And that's really important to understand that. And if we were doing a gap analysis, then we would draw a data flow diagram of the CUI for the company to say, this is what you have. And let's put a pin in that before we start talking about access controls at all, because maybe this isn't what you need to have. Maybe you've got an enterprise scope here and you could really get away with having an enclave scope. So if this is your footprint for CUI, is it possible to reduce that footprint? Because if you can reduce the footprint, then you can reduce your risk, you can reduce your costs, you can reduce the time to compliance. So there's a lot of benefit to taking that first painful step. And the analogy that I liked is that if you were building a house, you wouldn't build a house without knowing what your land is. And so understanding your CUI data flow is like understanding what your land is before you start putting the controls in place. So that's step number one. Some other things to do before you even get started is thinking about having a good GRC tool. You can manage all of this on spreadsheets, but it's really unwieldy and challenging and difficult, and it's hard to share across a team that's helping you with compliance if you're doing it that way. So there are a multitude of GRC tools out there now, and some specifically around, set for CMMC. So it's good to take a look at what's out there and make some smart decisions on that. And some of them will help you build your SSP dynamically. So for example, you can load all of your policies and procedures and snapshots and everything, and then select them as this is part of my control for this objective for this access control, for example. And then that will dynamically change your SSP. So depending on how sophisticated you are, how new you are to this, there are GRC tools that are designed for companies that really understand what they're doing. And then there are GRC tools that really do effective hand-holding throughout the entire process. If you're new and this is challenging and you want a GRC tool that's really like another person in your department. Another thing that we suggest for companies that we advise is to put at least one person in your organization through CCP training. That's the first level for an assessor. So it's a certified CMMC professional training. You don't need to have anybody in your organization trained as an assessor, but having them go through the CCP training helps them know what the assessors are looking for. This is an effective piece of evidence. This is the sets of assets that are going to be reviewed. This is how you need to communicate who your external service providers are. So it really sets the ground rules for what your team needs to do in order to be prepared. And then again, before we even start talking about putting together SSP, is understanding your asset categories. So people want to jump right in and think about their CUI assets, but they're another set of assets that's really important to think about are your contract or risk managed assets. And those are assets that could store CUI but don't or shouldn't, and you've got to show how they don't. So a really good example of that is if you have an engineering pool and there are 20 engineers in your engineering pool and only 3 of them work on a DoD contract, how are you keeping the other 17 engineers in that engineering pool from accessing CUI? How's the network configured? What are the access controls set up like? So all of those things are just as important. How the assets that shouldn't have CUI on them, why they don't have CUI on them, is as important as showing how you protect the ones that do have CUI or authorized to have CUI on them. And then security protection assets and specialized assets, and then demonstrating how things are out of scope. So when we come in to do the pre-assessment to see if a company is ready, the first thing that we do is we ask for an asset inventory that includes all those categories of assets, not just CUI assets. And then we ask for your SSP, and in your SSP, we want to see evidence that you've got we want to see that you have evidence against each of those control and control objectives. Those are important considerations. Your SSP should be robust and include evidence that points to, in a easy to follow manner, how each of the controls is met.
Thanks, Amy. That's a very well laid out sort of steps in terms of what needs to be done here. And Eric, I'll pivot this to you. A lot of what Amy shared, is that what your lived experience was? Is there any particular things of what she shared that you want to maybe comment on or highlight?
Yeah, absolutely. So everything that Amy said is the experience that we had in terms of the steps that she had laid out. What I will say is we do not have a GRC tool. It is on my roadmap, but we do not have a GRC tool, and that does make it a bit more difficult. What we did have is we have we have a folder structure that we had where all of the evidence was put in so that it could be referred to when we had the audit come in. But talking about gathering that documentation, looking at that documentation, making sure that it will suffice for the assessment. What I will say is we did go with an outside third party to help us. We're a very small team. We don't have a large team. So one of the struggles that we had was not having the resources. So once we looked at the assets like Amy talked about, once we had the security plan, and we realized we had gaps and we needed to address those gaps. That's where we needed extra help from an outside third party. So we did get an outside third party to help us with that documentation. And once they did that documentation, we did have a pre-assessment that Amy spoke about, fixed some gaps that we had there. And then we had the assessment with a C3PAO. And so it's very important, I think, also to what Amy said, is to have someone who has that CMMC knowledge. We do have a lead. He's focused on CMMC. He joins a lot of the conferences he's been to, webinars that he's on, and he has a lot of knowledge that was really helpful when we had the folks that were here to do the assessment, because he understood where they were coming from and the things that they were looking for. So having that knowledge was important as well. So, but I do wish we had the GRC tool, and we are looking to get that because CMMC is a program, not a project. So we need to keep that documentation. We need to update it. And so that is what I am looking to do in the future.
I really like how you frame that, Erica. It's a project, it's a program, not a project. And I'll also just maybe comment real quick to your point around the GRC tool. I think it's definitely critical. It makes life a lot easier. But for like the small and medium-sized organizations that may not necessarily have the resources to acquire or afford one, and I'll send this back to you, Amy. Any comments for like small organizations that really don't have as much resources as larger ones? And one other thing I would like you to clarify, Amy, is when you do your assessments, are you going off independently observed, reviewed artifacts, or are you going off attestations from what the subject says?
So to answer your first question, for the smaller companies, there are a number of resources that are available. We contrary to popular belief, even though we're a big company, we don't just work with big companies. We love working with small companies. We do our very best to do specific pricing. It's a challenge to go about doing it the way that we do it, but we want to make sure that we can reduce the cost as much as possible for any small company and that everybody is priced fairly. So the sales person, sometimes with me included, will go through a scoping document and sometimes have a scoping call to identify any way that we can reduce the cost. So if they're cloud-based only and they don't have CUI on-prem and they have an SSP and they've got a Spur score, all those things are things that we can say, well, we think this is going to be a less expensive engagement. If they're cloud-based, then we don't have to go on-prem at all for the assessment, so that helps reduce the cost. Another thing that we do to try to help companies that has been really very popular is to have a mock assessment before an assessment for companies of all sizes, because it's basically a preview and the score is exactly for you. And so companies are surprised. We have big and small companies that are really surprised by their score with the mock assessment, but then they can take that and we can't tell you how to remediate anything, but we can tell you what's met and what's not met. And there's a lot of powerful information in knowing this control's not met with what you gave us. And here's the cap. The CMMC assessment process is a publicly available tool. So we do the Carol Merrill, here is what we're looking for. That's not present in what you sent us. And so please go back and fix that. And then that makes a tremendous difference in how their assessments go. In terms of the assessment process itself, there's some onboarding and offboarding and all that, but really it's kind of a 3-week process for us, for your average to medium, medium-sized companies. Some are smaller and take less time, but most companies, we have you send us all your evidence. We have assessors that spend a week looking at the evidence. They make notes. This appears to be trending met. This appears to be trending not met. And then there's a week of interviews where we verify the things that appear to be met. Yes, those in fact do appear to be met, or something comes up. If something's not met, and we can talk through, this is the evidence that we're looking for. Sometimes companies will have that evidence, but they just didn't present it. So we can give them, up to 10 days after the assessment to put together that evidence. That additional time is not meant to fix something that's completely broken. It's meant to be, this control actually exists. You just didn't get us the right evidence. And that's a fairly common thing, because having evidence against 320 objectives is a pretty heavy lift.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then the third week is the report writing, and that's, and by the time we get to the report writing, there's no surprises. During
Yeah.
the interviews, we say, this is trending met, this is trending not met, at the end of every day. So at the end of every day, how you're doing with each control family.
Perfect. Thank you. I want to bring in Eric into the conversation. So let's talk about some of the enforcement trends and actions that we're seeing related to CMMC compliance. I think one of the key things I've heard about this is it's the nature of the nature of its enforcement is very much different from CMMC 1.0. It has a whole lot more teeth than it previously did. So, Eric, can you maybe provide some perspectives on the sort of enforcement landscape? Can you introduce us into the concept of the False Claims Act and the DOJ civil cyber fraud initiatives that you would want to comment on?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I spent, as you said when you introduced me, I spent years at the SEC. I also was with the DOJ for a period of time as a special USA for years, and worked closely with both agencies. And the thing is, the government, especially enforcement divisions of the government or the Department of Justice, when there's new rules, they see that as an opportunity for a couple different things. One is new ground to bring cases, and even though the government ideally is just fact finding and investigating leads, and their mission typically should not be to charge people. The reality is that if you're a prosecutor or you work for the SEC or other similar agencies, if you're even civil DOJ, one of the things you are looking to do is to find bad actors or to find misconduct and to bring cases. It's your job. And so if there's new rules, it provides new opportunities, new laws that can be enforced. The other related piece of that is often what the government really likes to do is when there's a new rule, they want those who are subject to the new rule to know how serious those rules are. And as often initiatives, sometimes we used to call them sweeps, and then as time went on, we would call them risk-based initiatives. They have different names. They all mean the same thing, which is we're gonna prioritize our resources to ensure that these new rules are being prosecuted or enforced, so that those who are subject to them take them very seriously, as if they weren't anyway, but they typically should be. But the idea, if we bring some cases in this space, will really make a point. And I think we should expect that going forward. Fundamentally, what are we seeing? I mean, even the last couple of years, you're seeing False Claims Act cases against companies who have, according to the government or relators, have submitted SPUR scores that were inflated. And we see examples where, from the government's perspective, those SPUR scores were not only false, but material to government contracts and to the claims that were submitted. And they can be, pretty substantial penalties as a result of those cases. And so the False Claims Act provides pretty broad area of enforceability when it comes to submitting scores to the government that the government may view as false. And and I'm sure Amy and Eric can speak more to this, but as things evolve, if there's no longer necessarily going to be direct submissions of SPUR scores by those subject to the rules, there'll be third-party assessments, as we talked about. There's still going to be annual attestations or affirmations that will be required, and those are going to be critical. The government views those as affirmations where it says what it says, meaning we are promising that what we're doing complies with the law, and there's an expectation that what you're saying can be relied upon by the government. And so it's going to be really important for those subject to these rules to be very thoughtful and careful about their processes around submitting information to the government in any context, whether it's the SPUR score itself or whether it's affirmations about NIST 800 171 control assessments. So what does that mean, though? I always think that when I meet new clients and others, they look at me as, I never want to talk to you. I hope I never have to talk to you, because that means things have gone badly. And I like to say, possibly, and it is definitely one of the collateral consequences of my career. But often what I like to do is help you not get the subpoena or the whistleblower in the first place. What does the government really expect? The government, in my experience anyway, I was there 15 years, doesn't expect perfection. They know there can be mistakes. They know there can be inaccuracies. What they want to see is good processes around what you're doing that are repeatable, and that you in good faith can support your decision making. So even if down the road someone second guesses your affirmation or your assessments or the SPUR scores that have resulted them, you want to be able to say to the government, if you're ever asked, that here was our process around this, here's what we did. Here's, for example, third parties we've used to come in and assess. And even if someone thinks our information is eventually wrong, it was done in good faith. And good faith is a defense to essentially any serious government allegation, especially under the FCA. In terms of other collateral consequences or considerations, I should say, the FCA is probably the main event here, but especially if you're a public company that may be subject to some of these rules, which is true for a lot of government contractors and others, you may have collateral considerations, shareholders, fiduciary duty obligations, SEC obligations in terms of your risk factors, and other related disclosure obligations. We know the SEC has been highly focused on cyber-related issues. And as you said at the top, in 2021, there was the DOJ Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative that was announced. The administration has obviously changed, but it doesn't mean that the government's any less focused on cyber, which many still think is, or in security around sort of sensitive information, which many still think is the major threat and issue to the U.S. today.
Got it. Thanks, Eric. That's very helpful. I want to maybe have Amy or Erica maybe comment. Is there anything you'd like to add up to Eric's comments or points you want to maybe underscore?
So as an organization that needs to comply with CMMC, and one that has recently gone through the certification, has the certification, this is definitely a concern for us. We want to make sure that we're doing what we say and we're saying what we're doing. And we're taking a reasonable approach to these controls and the requirements. So we definitely have instantiated this program and are working hard to ensure that these controls are in place. As Eric says, there's always going to be gaps that need to be remediated, controls that break, but for the most part, we're working to comply.
No, I'll just add, this is a little bit of a diversion, but I've been working in cybersecurity for a really long time. It's been considered a cost center when it really needs to be a strategic initiative. And it's terrible that it takes sticks like the False Claims Act to make people pay attention to it. And that kind of goes along with it being something that thou shalt do, thou must do, as opposed to CMMC could be a launch pad for companies. It could be, okay, this isn't perfect cybersecurity, but it helps us understand that there are these buckets of things that we need to do in order to be more secure. And yes, it's only just about confidentiality, and we need to do things for availability and integrity, but let's use this as a launching pad, and then let's explore maybe the NIST cybersecurity framework to build this with. But it continues to have this negative thing that we do instead of this positive thing that we go towards to prevent horrifying breaches. And the breaches are incredibly expensive. They're in hundreds of millions of dollars for medium-sized companies. So cybersecurity is really important. And
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a message I've also been preaching for a while myself, Amy. So you and I very well aligned on that. I think we need to shift away from this aspect where we view it more so as a cost, but as a strategic enabler for an organization, right? It could serve as a competitive differentiator for you as an organization. So I'm hopeful, that we are getting there, but we're not quite there. We still have ways to go. So let me move the conversation forward to the future trajectory of the CMMC regulations. So there's been a lot of chatters, and people talk about, the way the government operates. You have a new administration every 4 years, potentially. How does that impact the regulation? Especially, we have the current Trump administration. There is a mandate for deregulation and cost cutting. Is CMMC going to be impacted? So I would love to maybe get your respective perspectives on this and what you see as the future of in the future of CMMC. So Erica, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think that CMMC, from my perspective, from my team and others that we have talked to, I think CMMC is here to stay. I don't think it's going anywhere. I do think it's foundational to the where we are today in the world. Cybersecurity is becoming really important. It's a vector that is being utilized. So from our perspective, we don't see this going away. So which is why we have, this is a program that's instantiated within our organization. This is something that is part of our processes going forward. So there might be refinements, but we don't see it going away.
Eric, you want to provide your take on this as well?
Yeah, the crystal ball is always difficult, but I don't see it going away either. I think, as Amy said very well, the cybersecurity is such a huge focus. It's been a focus. I think it's increasingly becoming a focus for any number of reasons. And as administrations may change and sort of ultimate goals and ideas of what's best may change, I still think cybersecurity is going to be a root issue that's going to be a focal point going forward. I don't expect it to change personally.
Amy?
I've been to every CMMC conference that has been in the ecosystem in the last year, and there's always someone from the DoD talking about how they're going to, it's not going away, and they're expanding it. They're already talking about R3. They're anticipating an expansion beyond DoD. They're talking about how other parts of the government need to comply with NIST 800-171. They're not calling it CMMC yet, but that's how CMMC started. So there's no evidence that this is going away.
Okay, so it sounds we have a consensus and we all think this is here to stay. It's not going away. And I will be the fourth voice to that message. I do think it's here to stay. I've also had, Katie Arrington, for one, make comments that this is not going away. And she was one of the key voices in originating CMMC. So I do, place my bets that it's here to stay. So let's look at some of the questions we've received from the audience and go through a few questions as much as we can. Then we can sort of close. The first question I have on here is actually it's for Amy. So the question is, how are you seeing prime contractors handle the flow down requirements to subcontractors? So maybe first help us understand what are the flow down requirements and what does that mean?
That means that if you are going to have a subcontractor help you complete a DoD contract and CUI or FCI is a part of what needs to be flowed down, then that needs to be specified in the contract and how you have to state that you are in fact compliant with whatever CMMC requirement they're stating. And this is what CFR 48 is going to be bringing in the CMMC regulation. And what we're seeing, and I'd love to hear Erica's take on this as well, is my favorite thing that I'm seeing is some prime contractors setting up enclaves where possible for sharing CUI so that it doesn't have to flow down at all. And then policies and procedures can be standardized and set, and they can help their suppliers reduce their cost of compliance in a variety of different ways. They might not even need to flow down CUI if they can maintain it in their own enclave where people can securely connect to that. And then they might need to just have FCI compliance in place. So that's one thing that's happening. Also providing another thing that I love is Source America advertised publicly that they were offering scholarships to their member organizations that and you could send a proposal to them and say, this is what I want help with, and then they would have a set of preferred providers that would be able to provide that advice to them. And so then they would be assured that that advice was coming from, an effective uh, company that knew what they were talking about. And offering standardized policy and procedure templates to flow down. But Erica, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, sure. So we definitely have been concerned with this flow down and what that impact is going to have on our supply chain. The way we have started to approach it, we actually reached out to a third party that is helping us risk assess our supply chain. So we're grouping our supply chain, high risk, critical part of our supply chain, moderate and low risk. But then in addition to that, we have also we're reaching out to our high risk and our important supply chain partners to understand where they're at with CMMC compliance. And we have a list of those that are on track, those that are tracking but not there yet, and those that are not on track. In terms of those that are not on track, there are ongoing conversations about, is there another supplier that we can use? Are there things we can do to help them? Or to your point, Amy, are there things we can do to minimize what they need to do in order to comply? So those are some of the things that we're tackling right now. We're still in the middle of that process, but it's definitely something that's concerning to all of us.
So I do have a question for you, Erica. There's one here that I think is aligned more so for you. So from a CISO's perspective, what was your strategy for prioritizing and allocating resources, that's your budget, tools, and personnel for your CMMC Level 2 implementation? Again,
Yes.
I know it sounds like this is one of the common things a lot of CISOs contend with, the resource allocation. And what was your strategy for prioritizing CMMC?
Yes. So in terms of prioritizing, so first there was an assessment to understand what the impact would be to the organization. That scoping part was very important. And once that scoping piece happened, we quickly realized we're a very small team, that we were going to need resources. So then it was having the conversation with business, having conversation with executive management to help them understand what the requirements were and what it was going to take for us to get to where we needed to be for CMMC compliance. So we relied on utilizing external resources to help us with things like the documentation. We had a pre-assessment, I'll call it, that Amy had spoke about, so that we could understand like where we stood and what we needed to do in order to get to that final assessment where we could pass, and which we did. But the challenge for us was the limited resources. So the communication was important in making sure the business understood the impact, which actually explaining what CMMC was in very high level terms, and then what the requirements are going to be in the future, help the business understand, because we're in this industry, and so this is going to be a requirement. There's not going to be these contracts are going to come to us with these requirements in them. So it wasn't as hard of a sell. Management was on board early on. Then it was basically making sure that we identified what we needed, what resources we needed, what tools we needed, and then allocating the budget for that.
Sounds good. I do have actually two questions here for you, Eric. So the first one is, what is the most critical piece of advice you would give a defense contractor right now regarding their documentation and attestation processes to minimize their FCA exposure related to CMMC?
Yeah, I think it relates back to what I talked about earlier, which is, to me, the best thing you can do in these circumstances, especially when these assessments and affirmations around them are I think admittedly subjective, is to have a really thoughtful, thorough, repeatable process so that if anyone was to ask why you affirmed X or why you submitted Y and they had concerns that it was inaccurate, and not only inaccurate but material, you at least can say, well, it was done in good faith. And that's where you can, I think, defend yourself. But really, my view is we shouldn't be thinking about defending ourselves from FCA. It should be just in the first instance, what's the right way to proceed? And the right way to proceed, I think, is having, as Amy alluded to, the policies and procedures, and having a memorialized process you can basically repeat on a go-forward basis, especially because personnel change within companies. Companies mature over time. They change businesses. You want to have something you can point back to that gives you reliability in what you're doing on a go-forward basis.
Okay, thank you. The second question I see here for you is, how do you foresee, and I know we don't have crystal balls, but how do you foresee the materiality standard in FCA cases being applied when a contractor's CMMC attestation is found to be inaccurate? I think that's probably a spin-off of what you already responded to, but maybe the second part of the question here is, what level of deviation from CMMC requirements might be considered material?
I think so. I'm smiling in part because when I was in the government, with all respect to my friends who are still there, they often, hopefully I wasn't guilty of this, but often conflated inaccuracy with materiality. And so sometimes the government thinks everything's material. I think the potential difference going forward is there's a minimum requirements under the CMMC. So at least you now have like a threshold that if you were to provide an inaccurate score or affirmation on the same, that otherwise you would not have been eligible for a contract but for that score. I think that's a very clear line now where the government would say anything above that minimum requirement that they believe to be false is clearly inaccurate, is what would be my expectation going forward. But to be sure, that's not necessarily the entirety of what the government may view as material. So, every case is different. Materiality, as we know, is can be subjective in facts and circumstances. So I don't think I'd worry so much about whether the delta of one score to another is material, but more about, like I said, the processes around how we get to the score in the first place.
Got it. Okay. So for sake of time, I think audience, feel free to keep sending your questions. What we're going to do is we will come back to you and respond with those questions. But for sake of time, we're going to try to wrap this one up here at this point. So I do want to thank the very esteemed panelists for their invaluable insights. This was definitely a very helpful, important discussion to have. I learned so much. And there's a number of things that have been shared today. CMMC is real. I've heard there's a unanimous view here that it's not going away. It's extremely important to scope your environment correctly, and that scoping exercise seems to be very, very critical. And having the right documentation is extremely critical as well. And some of the things we've learned from the legal standpoint as well is do things in good faith. You can make mistakes, but as long as you have clear, reasoned, documented processes and you do act in good faith, no reason to not move forward. So I will, thank again the panelists for providing their thoughts, and reach out to any of us if you have any further questions and you'd like to discuss this topic further. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you.